everybody, my name is Scott Waters. Welcome to Nolifetilmetal Metal. Gonna do something a little bit different today, kind of I don't know, a rant, a history lesson, whatever you want to call it. I love metal, I love hard rock. I literally loved it since the 70s when I was a kid in grade school. I mean, I'm telling you, I actually got into fights in grade school with people who were into, Sean Cassidy and the Jackson 5, while I was jamming to Aerosmith and Ted Nugent and Led Zeppelin. You know what I mean? So I remember literally getting into a fight over talking about Draw the Line and with somebody who was a Jackson 5 fan. I mean, a stupid juvenile, kid thing to do. But I'm just saying, I was into metal when I was a kid, when I was, in grade school in the 70s. And I am now in my early 50s, and I still love heavy metal. I still love hard rock. I still love everything connected with it, including the history of it. But what I've noticed over the last, 10 years, maybe a little longer than that, is this bizarre history revisionism by younger fans who seem to think that heavy metal didn't exist until the 80s. And even some of the 80s bands are now being accused of being just hard rock. And it kind of drives me nuts. So I thought I'd just talk about that a little bit. Over the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks or so, I posted some 70s magazines onto Facebook, and I wanted to show a couple of those. First of all, this is one I just loved, Grooves magazine back in the day. So this is Grooves magazine. It dealt with pop music back in the time, and this is the issue they put out in 1978, I think this was. And both Queen and Aerosmith were huge in '78. I mean, absolutely huge. They were selling out stadiums. So you got the UK band versus the American band, and this particular magazine was a contest, and it was half and half. Half the magazine's Aerosmith, half the magazine's Queen, and it was the Titanic battle for the heavy metal crown. And inside the magazine, there was this definition of heavy metal that I wrote down and I thought I'd read to you. It says, heavy metal, stacks of speakers and high voltage amps, deep, thunderous, surging sounds from the bass, screaming lead guitars emitting doomsday warnings, pumped up percussion, instruments and minds being demolished on stage. There is no subtlety in heavy metal. It's the hardest of hard rock, with electric shock treatments and vibrating air churning right before your eyes. And the sledgehammer that powers the American heavy metal machine is undeniably Aerosmith. Grooves Magazine, 1978. Just in case you're wondering, here's the follow-up issue that told you who the winner was, and Aerosmith won by a marginal narrow over Copper Queen, just because they were hugely popular at the time. So there you go. So that's a pretty decent description and definition of what heavy metal is. And the funny thing is, around 1978-79, a lot of the heavy metal bands were losing their ways. But let me go back and start over. When did heavy metal begin? And that's kind of where the sticking point is. I posted a very small, very poignant statement saying that heavy metal basically was a genre that existed in the 70s, or first existed in the 70s, and was, it's generally accepted that bands like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and of course Black Sabbath are generally, equated as the fathers of heavy metal. Led Zeppelin, less these days, it seems, than they used to be. I remember back in the 80s, even in the late 70s, having discussions with people over who was the true, beginners of heavy metal. And it was, people would argue back and forth between Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, the Zeppelin fanatics and the Sabbath fanatics. And I honestly think it's a combination of both. I don't think either one of them could be listed as the first heavy metal band. I think the two of them, along with Deep Purple and a lot of other things, is what culminated into what became the first wave of heavy metal that came out in the early 70s. So you had Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, and then there was other bands, Budgie, UFO, Motorhead. There was just so many bands that came out of Europe in the 70s, not including worldwide with bands like the Scorpions. When Uli Roth was in the band, Thin Lizzy. There was tons of bands. In the U.S. we had the beginnings of heavy metal with Alice Cooper, and very few people would deny that these guys had a big hand in what heavy metal was, even though I wouldn't call them heavy metal by any stretch of the imagination. But Steppenwolf, proto metal. I mean, their song "Born to Be Wild" came out in 1968. I think it was January 1960. Actually, I wrote it down. Where did I write it down at? Right here. Born to Be Wild, January 1968. So that song, Born to Be Wild, where the term heavy metal came out of, basically, came out of a song written and recorded in 1967 and 1968 when the song came out. A good friend of mine, John, Captain Hattie, you might know him from the vinyl community as well. He believes that Helter Skelter, which came out a few months later in November of 1968, was the first heavy metal song. Regardless, you can't really say what was the first. I mean, you know, if you're going to put Helter Skelter up against Born to Be Wild and say these were the first heavy metal songs, I'm not going to argue with you. I mean, those were definitely some of the earliest heavy metal songs. Those were definitely the beginnings of what would become, you know, a whole new genre of music that would just explode into a first wave of heavy metal in the 70s. Of course, then there's also Jimi Hendrix. I mean, you know, this album came out in 1968, I believe it was. These old 60s albums, funny, they don't have dates on the back. It was before they put dates on albums. But yeah, Jimi Hendrix Experience, no one's going to deny the impact that that Jimi Hendrix had on an entire generation of music going forward. I mean, the Scorpions with Julia Roth were hugely influenced by Jimi Hendrix, and you can hear it in those early Scorpions records. I mean, even the Beatles were, you know, kind of taken back by what Jimi Hendrix did. You know, tons of bands were, and you can't blame him. I mean, he revolutionized a sound. It was heavier, it was darker, it was different, you know, and these were the beginnings of heavy metal. Again, I'm not saying Jimi Hendrix was a heavy metal artist. He was a blues artist, he was a pop artist, he was a rock artist, he was a guitar player. But there's no denying his impact on what will become heavy metal. And then also, of course, you had bands like Blue Cheer, who, again, I wouldn't describe as a heavy metal band, but they were definitely that kind of proto-metal sound. They were very loud, obnoxious, in your face, you know. Summertime Blues, another song that came out in, you know, what was it, 1967, 68? I don't remember what year this came out now. I think it might have been 67. But regardless, I mean, another song that you could say was one of the early, you know, heavy metal songs, proto-metal songs. So you've got this whole group of, you know, bands from the 60s that kind of culminated into what became, you know, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, and Deep Purple, generally referred to as the early heavy metal bands coming out of Europe. And, you know, so there you go. That's basically your history of heavy metal and where it came from. And that's the early 70s, you know, early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. Very few people are going to deny Black Sabbath, and even today, people won't deny that Black Sabbath were, you know, one of the first heavy metal bands, although people will argue to the hilt that Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin never were now. So it's funny. So anyhow, let me show you a couple of the magazines that I posted. So this was actually towards the end of the 80s, all right? So now, you got to remember now, by mid-70s, bands like Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath were beginning to suffer from, I don't know, overdose of drugs, member fighting. Things weren't well. You know what I mean? And those bands were beginning to wane in popularity, and there was a whole new wave of bands that were coming up out of America in the mid-70s, like Aerosmith, Ted Nugent. There's a ton of them. You know, Aerosmith, Ted Nugent, and then out of Canada as well. There was just Rush. There was just all these bands that were coming out that were kind of a second wave of heavy metal coming out of North America in the mid-80s, mid-70s. And look at like a California Metal. Excuse me. Look at California Jam. So your first wave of popular heavy metal was, you know, shown off in California Jam when you had bands like Deep Purple and Black Sabbath and whatnot coming out of Europe. The second wave, or California Jam 2, was all American bands. So now you had, you know, Frank Marino and Ted Nugent and Aerosmith, and these were the bands that were big in the late 70s. So, you know, again, I show these magazines, and immediately upon showing them, so let me just go ahead and show them. This is 1978. Is heavy metal dead? So, again, by this late 70s, heavy metal was beginning to have a identity crisis. So you had bands like Kiss who were moving towards a different direction. You had bands like Queen who were moving towards a different musical direction. And the big mainstream bands were starting to fall apart. You know, Aerosmith was fighting from within and falling apart. Sabbath were separating from Ozzy and were falling apart. They hadn't yet hooked up with Dio. Deep Purple were together no more. I mean, so a lot of these bands are just falling apart at the seams. So it seemed that heavy metal was dying. At least to the mainstream media or mainstream magazines like Cream and Circus and Grooves and all those kind of things that heavy metal was dying. So is heavy metal dead? So this was a pretty common theme in a lot of magazines in 1978 and 79, and I find them amusing because they were talking to these artists who were the heavy metal bands at the time about, is heavy metal dead? Is heavy metal dying? And some of them didn't know. They were confused. They didn't know what musical direction to take. I mean, look at Kiss. They actually recorded a disco song, in 1979. So Led Zeppelin was gone, by that time as well. So, heavy metal dead. So these are a couple of the magazines that I posted from that. And then I posted a few articles, including that Grooves. And, of course, as soon as I post that kind of stuff, I get this influx of people who are like, none of those bands are even heavy metal. None of those bands are heavy metal. So I start going into these, arguments. Well, then who was heavy metal in the 70s? It didn't exist in the 70s. It was in the 80s. Or there was only a couple bands. It was just Judas Priest and Black Sabbath. All the others are just hard rock. Really? So this whole heavy metal movement of the 70s didn't even exist, according to history revisionists. It's just mind-blowing to me, with a plethora of, physical printed evidence. Great documentaries like VH1 Classic did this awesome series. I actually pulled it up just so I could make sure I had the name correctly. Metal Evolution series. Banger Films Productions did this awesome series. There's like 12 videos in the series. Each of them are like 45 minutes to an hour long, and they start off with the proto-metal stuff from the 60s, like I was discussing. Even things like Dick Dale, and how he played a part in the early invention of the genre we know as heavy metal. Then they go into the early years of heavy metal, and of course they discuss the UK bands, and you get your Black Sabbath and your Led Zeppelin and your Deep Purple, your Budgie, your Uriah Heep, all those bands that were coming out of Europe in Motorhead, UFO, all those bands that were coming out of Europe in the 70s. And then they discuss, and they have a third video, which is the American Wave. And again, they discuss the same bands I just talked about. You got your Aerosmith and Kiss and Ted Nugent and all those bands that were huge in the 70s that were considered heavy metal at the time. So plethora of information. So you've got documentaries, you got books. I've got tons of books that I've read over the years. One of my favorites, I go to this book all the time. There's actually 4 of these books. Martin Popoff's Collector's Guide to Heavy Metal. This is the 70s edition. And guess who's in it? Aerosmith and Ted Nugent and Van Halen and and Judas Priest and Black Sabbath and Deep Purple and Uriah Heep and Budgie and all those bands that we consider heavy metal from the 70s, or the first wave of heavy metal from the 1970s. And there's tons of books like this. I particularly like Martin Popoff's writing style. I enjoy his books. Don't always agree with his opinions as far as, what he likes and doesn't like, but I know his writing style and I know his tastes well enough that I can judge, even if he doesn't like an album, whether I'll like it or not. So I really enjoy his books, and I'm actually reading through another one right now. I thought I'd just show Agents of Fortune, another early American heavy metal band, Blue Oyster Cult, and this is their Agents of Fortune book written by Martin Popoff. So there's tons of books written on heavy metal. There's, like I said, the VH1 Classic videos. There's periodicals from the time period. There's reviews from the time period. I don't know if I pulled it up or not. Oh yeah, even Wikipedia. Let's see, I did pull it up. Let's see if it's still here or not. Yeah. Wikipedia even says, critics disagree over who can be thought of as the first heavy metal band. Most credit either Zeppelin or Sabbath, with American commentators tending to favor Zeppelin and British commentators tending to favor Sabbath. I don't know about that or not, but regardless, Sabbath and Zeppelin, definitely the first and the contenders for those who kind of began that whole heavy vibe, that whole heavy metal movement. Deep Purple, the third band, is somewhat considered the unholy trinity of heavy metal. Despite being slightly older than Black Sabbath and Zeppelin, fluctuated between many rock styles in the early 60s. In 1968, the sound would become known as heavy metal began to coalesce. That January, San Francisco Blue Cheer released a cover of Eddie Cochran's Summertime Blues from their debut Vinicus. I can never say the name of this album. Vincibus Eruptum, that many consider to be the first true heavy metal recording. Like I said, again, all this is doing is reiterating what I've already said, and then they go into the same thing about bands like Alice Cooper and Ted Nugent and Aerosmith being the American Wave, and bands like Uriah Heep and Black Sabbath and Budgie being the the European wave, and of course there's global, global bands like, you got Rush over in Canada, and you've got Scorpions over in Germany. There's just tons of bands, all over the world. So it was the first wave. And then in the 1980s, after this so-called heavy metal is dead thing happened, we got what was considered a second wave of heavy metal, and we got magazines. Again, this is Cream magazine saying, back from the dead. It never really died. This is only not even a year later after they published, well, maybe it was a year. This, I think, might have been 78. Oh, this is October of 79, so is heavy metal dead? And then this is, where's the year on this one? October of 80. So exactly 1 year later, they're asking, is heavy metal dead? And now it's back from the dead. So you see you got Rob Halford on the cover. Back from the dead, heavy metal. Here comes the goons. Van Halen, Blue Oyster Cult, Black Sabbath, Joe Perry Project, AC/DC, Judas Priest, Def Leppard, Crocus, Lucifer's Friend, Triumph, Blackfoot, Iron Horse, Scorpions, Iron Maiden, Riot, Saxon, and so much more. So, again, a plethora of printed images, printed magazines from the time that say, this is what heavy metal was in the 70s. Now you have a second wave that coming along in the 80s. And bands like Iron Maiden and Def Leppard and Saxon, that were up-and-coming bands that, formed in the late 70s and now becoming popular in the 80s. So we had a whole wave. And you had bands, again, worldwide, bands from Canada. You had Anvil, or bands from the United States. You had bands like The Rods. They were just Twisted Sister. Bands, there were just so many bands coming from all over the United States for this whole huge second wave. And what puzzles me is how people can deny that there ever even was a first wave. And then I get all these people who are on Facebook and other places I have this discussion saying, these bands weren't heavy metal, they're just hard rock. They were never heavy metal. They were never called heavy metal. I even get people who grew up in the era saying, I never called them heavy metal, so I don't think they are. Really? So, and people will fight me over these magazines saying they're all wrong. All of them are wrong. So VH1 Classic, the whole thing they did, all these history books that you've read, you see out there on the history of heavy metal, all these period magazines from that time period, they're all wrong, and they always kind of bring up the same points. It's always, well, look at Jethro Tull, who won a heavy metal thing over Metallica. Obviously, the media is not always right. Okay, yeah, they're not always right. But this is not just one magazine, one show, saying what metal was. This was the fans at the time. This is everybody at the time. You're just discounting every bit of physical evidence to say, well, in my opinion, it didn't exist. Well, in my opinion, it's not this. Well, I don't think. Fact is, this is history. You cannot change history. These were the first bands. This is where heavy metal came out of. AC/DC, Led Zeppelin, Queen, Van Halen, Aerosmith, Ted Nugent, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Budgie. This is the first wave of heavy metal. That it's just a fact. I mean, you can argue all you want that they weren't. They're just hard rock, but you're wrong. I mean, a fact of the matter, I can't understand why people can't get that. Why can't I be wrong? The facts. I mean, if I was standing in the court of law trying to prove my case, there's a plethora of information that you could go over and say, this proves that these bands were the first wave of heavy metal, that the fans considered her the first wave of heavy metal, that the record companies, the media, everybody called these bands the first wave of heavy metal. Because some stupid award show 20 years later thinks Jethro Tull was better than Metallica and the best metal band of the year has nothing to do with what happened in the 70s when that form of music was just being formed. It was brand new. It was exciting. It was, this is what it is. It's ridiculous that people would even argue it. But anyhow, that's where it is. And I'm kind of curious what you all think. To me, this was the first wave of American heavy metal. Blue Oyster Cult, Aerosmith, Toys in the Attic. I mean, if anybody can listen to this album all the way through and say this isn't as heavy as things from the same year from bands like Black Sabbath and any other band you want to call heavy metal, Budgie, from the same year, and you can listen to this and say it's not, I don't know what you're listening to. I get those guys who come in and say, well, Dude Looks Like a Lady. Dude Looks Like a Lady was another decade away. That was the mid-'80s. It's a different time period. You can't take songs from '80s and saying, well, because they recorded Dude Looks Like a Lady, they were never a metal band. That's ridiculous. That's like saying, our Kiss was never metal band because they recorded a disco song, and therefore they were never. That's ridiculous. Ted Nugent. I mean, if anybody wants to get mellow, you can turn around and get the idea. The guy was all about heavy. Nobody was playing heavy music like Ted Nugent. Sound Magazine said he was the heaviest musician alive at the time, and of course, one of the biggest influences on an entire generation of heavy metal. Kiss. Like them or not, you don't have to like their music to admit that they were hugely influential. I'm not a huge Beatles fan, but I love their history. I admit that they're a huge influence in rock and roll, heavy metal, and pop. I've even taken classes, college classes, on the history of the Beatles, because I really do love the history of the music and the history of all of it. So even though I'm not a big fan of listening to the Beatles music, I don't deny their impact in what they did. So it's not well, you don't like the Beatles, so therefore you can't. No, it's not that. This is history. How can you change that? So I'm curious what you all think. I'm sure I'm going to get those who still going to say that, there was no first wave of heavy metal in the 70s. It didn't exist until the 80s. I've even had people tell me that Iron Maiden were the first metal band and Slayer were the first metal band. Come on, man. Thrash metal wasn't even the first wave of heavy metal. Thrash metal was a combination of the speed of punk with heavy metal. These bands, they built on each other's legacy. So you had these 60s bands who built on the 70s bands, and these 70s bands became huge, and then you had all these other bands that built on the legacy of those bands and made heavy metal, expanded it even more. And then you get into the 80s and it was expanded even more, and now you've got just a juggernaut, this huge umbrella of what heavy metal is, with just genres, just from everywhere. So anyhow, just a bit of a rant, bit of a history lesson, whatever you want to call it. I just thought I'd discuss it on my YouTube channel, since I discuss it quite often on Facebook and social media. So curious your thoughts. Let me know what you think. Appreciate y'all watching, listening. God bless. Stay strong.